and welcome back to another tutorial with Ghetto Coding. So in this tutorial we're going to be looking at just creating a simple cache helper in a web environment. So that being a web API, we're using .NET 5. So as you can see, I'm in Visual Studio 2019. Let's create a new project. It is a web-based project, so let's select next. Okay, it's going to chuck it in my default repo folder. So let's call this cache service .NET 5. Let's create that. Okay, so we're in .NET 5 there. ASP.NET Core Web API. We don't need HTTPS. That's fine. Yeah, we can enable Open API support. That's fine. Let's create it. Okay, so here we are in our project. So firstly, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using dependency injection and just following like the generic way of building services within a .NET Core environment. So with that said, let's get straight into it. So let's just clean up the project. Firstly, we don't need this pre-built weather model and controller. So that's done. Also, let's just add the references to some of, there's actually only one NuGet package we need to add. So that being the Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC Newtonsoft JSON package. Okay, there you go, it's already found it. Let's install that. Next, let's sort out the services we're going to need. So let's add them to our configured service here. So that specifically being the memory cache service that we need access to. So to do that, we're going to say services dot add memory cache. Next, let's just create a bit of structure here. Let's create the folders that we need. So I'm going to add a folder called services. Within that folder, we're going to add 3 more folders. Implementation. So that's just going to be where our actual code sits for each service. Our interface folder. Oops. Right, and then any models, I guess, we're going to need. Now we need to create some classes. So let's start with implementation. We're going to add a class. That class, we'll just call it caching service. Okay, let's add the interface. Call that iCaching service. And then let's add a result model. And let's just call this, I don't know, cache result model. Alright, let's now start with the implementation side of things. So y'all, we're going to keep this simple. We need to store, obviously, objects in cache memory, but we're going to be doing it as JSON strings or JSON objects. So what are the 3 things we want to do? Firstly, we want to be able to store an object in cache memory. Number 2, so call that number 1. Number 2, retrieve an object from cache memory, and I guess we might want to also delete an object from cache memory. Alrighty, so with that said, let's do some dependency injection here. There we go. Alrighty, now for our constructor. Right, that's dealt with. So, number one, storing. Retrieving, let's call it retrieve. And then deletion, just call it delete. Also, before we actually start here, let's create our return object. So I was thinking about this. Let's have just a couple of enums for just general statuses. So let's just call it cache status. And okay, I always do this, result pending. Okay, so let's say that is, so that's obviously 0. Okay, then we'll have, say the item was cached, so we'll just say cached. Code 1, so the item was deleted, that'll be 2. So for example, an object doesn't exist in the cache. Does not exist. That'll be 3. Okay, and well, what happens if something does exist? So we'll just say exists. And so an error occurs, let's just say error. And we all know that is the last one, so that is 5. So what are we going to need when we store a object and we want a result? So we're probably going to want to know, well, if it was successfully stored, what the cache key was that we provided, maybe the value, obviously the status, and possibly if an exception occurs. So let's create that. Public, let's just call it public string, and also cache key. Okay. The value we cached, whoops, all over the place this morning. Then our status, obviously. And I'll just call it cache status. And I guess if an exception or error occurs, so let's just, also what we're going to do is, let's make it internal, as we don't want to expose this to the end user. And let's just create a quick constructor here. And this constructor is going to require that you pass the key on initiation. And let's just give these default values. And cache status equals There you go. Result pending. And error. Let's make it null. It's fine. Don't actually really have to do that, but anyway. Alrighty. Let's go back to the caching service. So my plan is for each aspect here being storing, retrieve, and delete, we're going to create a async version and then just a sync version for each. So storing will have async and one synchronous call, same for retrieve and delete. So let's start with the async. So what we're essentially going to do here is we're just going to firstly check if what we are caching already exists, and whether if it doesn't exist, we'll obviously create it. Otherwise, we will have a feature that or parameter that we pass to this method that you can force an override. So even if it does exist, you can just overwrite it and initiate a new expiry time or etc. So with that said, let's continue here. So we're going to have our cache result here. Sort that reference out. Boom. So let's say save to, oh, not Dave, save to cache async. Now, what are the values we're going to need? Alright. So the values we're going to need is, we need to allocate a unique key which will identify a cache object. We need to know how many hours this item must be cached for, along with minutes. Alright, and we can do seconds as well. So we've got int expiry hours, expiry minutes, and expiry seconds. And then the dynamic object, so to speak, that being type generic, we'll just say object to cache, and then bool if we want to force an override. Override, yeah, I think that looks good. Cool. So let's start. So firstly, we need to initiate our result object. Should I say return object? Okay. And we know we need to pass the key to that. And if we do run into an exception, let's handle that now. Error. Cool. Sorted. And we know we're going to be returning this result. So let's get that out of the way. So let's initiate our cache object, create a blank version. So we know that we're doing JSON strings here. So let's do that. So let's just call this cached object equals string.empty. Cool. So this is the async version. So await task.run. And whoops, I need those in there as well. So firstly, we're going to check if the cache object exists. So by doing that, we'll say cache.try get value. We know we're dealing with strings here, as we're dealing with JSON objects. So with that said, obviously, we need to tell it where to look, what we're looking for, in other words. So we're going by key, because that's the unique key that will be able to tell us where in the memory cache to look for it. Think of it as like a primary, like an ID, like a primary key. And then we're going to be output the out variable, being that being our string, right? Cool. So basically what happens here is, what we're saying is, if the item is not cached, so it will step in here if the cached, should I say, if the key can't be found, right? So meaning it hasn't been cached, or that key and object has not been cached, we're now going to cache it. So firstly we need to create a time span, because that's what is just required. You'll see now what I'm talking about. So let's just say time equals new time span, and we need to provide hours, so we've got that, minutes, and seconds. Cool. Sorted. Next, we need to convert the object we're trying to cache, okay, the generic object that we've passed, into a JSON string. So let's do that. So cached object equals mutansoft.json, dot convert, or JSON convert, sorry. And we want to serialize it. Serialize object, and the object obviously being the object we want to cache. Object to cache, straight and forward enough. Right, now we need to actually cache this bugger. So to do that, we do cache.set. Alright, is of type string that we are caching. Alright, and it requires the key, the actual value, now that being our JSON object, object, so that's the object to cache, and then obviously the time span indicating how long this object is essentially going to live for. When I say live for, basically be stored for. What have I done wrong here? Oh, sorry. Cache. Whoopsie. Cached object, or object should I say. I should have called that cached, or object to be cached. But nonetheless, I'm babbling now. Okay, now we know that we have now cached this object. We want to now make it part of our result. So we have got cache value. Oops, not cache status. So that's essentially the cached object, the JSON string. Okay. Then we also want to specify the actual status. So if it makes it this far, we know it's obviously been cached. So cached. Cool. All right. If the object does exist, okay, say the key already exists, so we've got to handle that now. This is where overwrites and stuff comes in, okay? So cool. So now let's handle this. So firstly, if force overwrite, oopsie, is false, okay? All we're returning is we're basically just going to state that it exists. Remember, we're keeping this service simple. So, I mean, I guess we could go and obtain the current version and return it. Say, well, it exists. Here's the current value. But that's going to, we're going to make, I mean, what's the point if we're going to be creating a return object anyway? Not a return object, a fetch method. So, next, what happens if we do want to override it? So the value does exist. So we do the same thing. You literally take all of this here and we dump it in here because that's what we want to do. And now that's done. So the difference now with the async and the sync is very straightforward. I'm literally going to take all this code here can actually take the whole method. Okay. Boom, let's get rid of that. Let's get rid of this. Let's get rid of this. And we are good to go. Storing is done. So I hope this makes sense to you. We pass a key, the expiration date, the object, generic object we want to cache, and then whether we want to overwrite the current cache storage if the key already exists in cache memory. So let's see if we can try get the value with the key we've provided. Okay, if that key can't be found, we create that cache object. All right. If the object already with that key already exists in cache memory, we then say, okay, well, do we want to override it? Or should I say overwrite it, not override it? So overwrite it? No, we don't. So we just return a cache status of, well, it already exists. Otherwise, we overwrite it. Simple as that. And obviously the same applies to both the async and sync version. Cool. So let's start with the async version of this. So let's just call this retrieve from cache async, and let's pass our key so we know what we're looking for. So as normal, let's initiate our result object here. Whoopsie. Whoopsie. Okay. And I'm going to be lazy. So cool. So the same applies. We need to specify the actual, we need to initiate the cached object. Okay, well, the value that's going to the cached object being, whoops, the object that's actually being cached. And that's obviously the JSON string in this case. Cool. So right, let's try get the value first. So we know this already. Specify the key and the out parameter. That obviously now being our cached object. So if the key does not exist, we simply do this. Does not exist. Alright, else we want to populate our result with the cached object and return it. As simple as that. Cool. So I'm being lazy. Let's create the sync version. And we are good. Cool. Right, retrieval is done. So straightforward, we pass a key, we do the norm here, we initiate our result object, we try get the value. If the value does not exist, we just return a status of does not exist. Otherwise, if it does exist, we specify the cache status of exists, and then bind the output object, that being the cached object associated with that key, to our cache value, and then we return it. Any errors that occur, we return that cache status there and bind the exception to the result.error variable of our result object. Cool. Now we need to get to the delete aspect of this implementation. So here's our shell for our delete from cache async method. I just put it together as it's basically the exact same structure as other methods from a shell perspective. So let's do the norm here. Okay, we're now going to check if the object actually even exists in cache. Oops. Note type string, as it's in JSON string. We need to specify the key and the out object, so for example, if it actually exists, although we're not going to be using it even if it does. Okay, whoopsie. Whoopsie. Cool. So, if it does not exist, there's nothing to delete. Does not exist. But if it does exist, we say, whoops, so we go else, and we say underscore cache simple as this dot remove, and we specify for which key we want to remove it for. Then we say result dot cache status, and we say it has been deleted. Also, let's just keep in mind here, this is our async version. So let's sort that out. Await task.run, and we are done. So now for the sync version, it's very straightforward. It's the same thing as you already know, but without this. And without this. And without this. Cool, and we are done from an implementation perspective. Now let's sort out our interface. So there is our interface, which we've inherited from. Now we need to expose our methods via the interface. So to obviously do that, we add our method abbreviations from our caching service class to the iCaching service interface, which must be public, obviously. And then there are all the abbreviations to our methods. But we are using dependency injection. So we need to add this service to our startup. So to do that, we're adding a scoped service. So services.add scoped, and it's the iCaching and that is a implementation of the caching service. Great, we are now ready to show off what we have developed. So now that we're ready, let's create a controller. An API controller to be specific. So firstly, we need an object to cache. So let's just create a dummy object. So say, for example, you have a website where you want to list the latest user who registered on your site or something like that. So you want to cache that. Every time a user registers a new user, you want to just cache the latest user. So let's create a dummy object like that. So they have a name or username. Let's say this is just a random, I don't know, social type platform. So say they have a hobby. I might be spelling that wrong. But either way, is it with a Y? Or is it like that? Let's take the shorter route. And stuff it. Maybe we need to know their age. So let's put their string, latest, username, string latest, hobby, and int latest age. Okay, so there is our dummy object or cache. Let's just sort out the dependency injection here quickly. Alright, so we're ready to go. Let's start with our methods now. Or should I say API calls. So let's just subdivide our stuff here. Okay, so I quickly just typed out a bit of a base method here. So let's start with the root. So we're going to do the async store. So let's just call it store async. And let's just say cache object async. Okay. So let's say the user's name is Ghetto. Their hobby is running. Wait. Kung Fu, because it's cooler. And their age is 25. Now we want to cache this thing. Alright. So, cache, we've got to sort this reference out, yeah? So, cache service, that's our service. And we want to save to cache async. And so we need the key, the hours, let's just say 0 hours, 5 minutes and 30 seconds. the object we want to cache. So that's object to cache, to store, sorry. And we want to force an overwrite, yes. And if that executes all successfully, or either way, we're going to just return it whether it executes successfully or not. Perfect. So there we have it. So now we can do the same for the sync version. So we'll just call that store. We don't need this. And let's change the name here. Steph, and her hobby is being a douche, and her age is 31. Right. And we want to overwrite again. Great, so now that we've got some examples here, let's now do the retrieval. So let's create another region here for retrieval. Okay, so we'll start with the async again. Let's just sort out our root. And we'll just say the path to this, we'll just call this fetch async. The capital letters there actually doesn't matter. HTTP get public async task cache. Oh wait, what am I saying? And we'll just say fetch async. And we want to specify the key for which cache object we want to obtain. So firstly, let's create our result here. Cache result model, we'll just say result equals await underscore our cache service. And we're going to say dot retrieve from cache async and specify the key and return an OK whether it fails or not. This is simply just a tutorial. Great. And anyway, our result will indicate through the cache status whether an error occurred or not. Obviously, if you had to expand on that, my advice is you log that shit. But I guess we can do that in another tutorial. Boom, fetch is done, or retrieve is done. Now, let's delete some shit. Whoa, not bad. So let's start with the async again. So let's hit the root, y'all. Delete async. And we want to specify, whoopsie, which key that we're going to be deleting the object for. Okay, so again, cache result model, let's just say result equals await underscore cache service dot delete from cache async. Hell yes, there's the key. Done. Return. Okay. This must sound annoying to you. Boom. And we can do the same again, but for sync. See what naming does for you. When you name your methods nicely, how quick and easy it is to alter them. Alrighty guys, so that now leaves us with one thing left to do. Test this sucker. So now that Swag is up and running, we can test our API calls. So let's start with the store async. And remember, for store async, we created the user called ghetto. Well, we initiated a new instance of that cache object and then stored ghetto within. Well, we will be storing ghetto within our cache. And the key we're specifying under which the cache must be stored and linked to is called new user. So we got a cache status of 1. 1 is cached. That's great. And that's what we cached under that key. So that's great. Okay. Let's see if we can now fetch that information for that specific key. So remember, we're using new user as the key. And there we go. New user, there's the object, the JSON object stored for that key. And we had a cache status of 4, which means it exists. That's great. So let's now delete this cache object linked to that key. Okay, cache key, new user, the cache value is empty, we've removed it, and the cache status of 2, meaning it's been deleted. Cache status deleted equals 2. So that's a good thing, because that's what we wanted to do. Let's try fetch now, to make sure. Boom, new user, cache value, we get a status of 3, does not exist. Alright, so now let's just run through the sync versions as that stores the user Steph. And let's try a different key now. Let's just say uKey. Okay, we know 1's good because that's been we want to store, and we know now that 1 is cached, stands for the status cache. There's the object we've cached. Steph, her hobby is being a douche and her age is 31 under that key. Now let's do the fetch for that. Boom, we got Steph the douche. Obviously there's nothing different in fetch async and fetch from what is returned. So if we look for uKey, as you can see, the last fetch was nothing, but we should now get Steph because that's what's currently stored within that key. So now let's delete Steph the douche. Two stands for deleted. We know that's a good thing. Let's see if she has actually been deleted. So there is the last call we made to fetch. Boom, she's gone. Alright guys, so that brings us to the end of this tutorial. I hope this is helpful, and hopefully we catch you on the next one. Cheers, peace out.